Mohammed Yunus, a Bangladeshi banker, once said that if we look at the financial system around the globe, more than half the population of the world do not qualify to take out a loan from a bank. Since 2001, he was wrong. Regulations were loose, and the financial industry was creating new innovations under order from the government to take on more loans. These innovations included CDOs and CMOs, abbreviated from collateralized debt or mortgage obligations. The question that the public is now asking is who caused the crisis? Why are we unemployed? And like every other recession, everyone is looking to point fingers. But the truth of the matter is that there wasn't only one determinant, but many. CDOs and CMOs being part of these bunch of determinants. Much of the financial crisis was not caused because of these innovations, but because people didn't know how to use them in the appropriate manner. I will first illustrate how collateralized mortgage obligations work, and then move on to how they partially caused the crisis, with interviews taken from many renowned economists, quants experts, and financial directors. Much of the world is in dark as to these innovations, and I am here to turn them the light. I hope you enjoy. The general public start looking for money to buy houses, and therefore choose to create mortgages with commercial banks. These commercial banks supply their customers with money in return for a mortgage agreement with a certain percentage of interest in order to increase the assets on their balance sheet. However, these mortgages are usually subprime and include teaser rates to attract customers, essentially hooking them into a contract with unknown future interest.
We managed our way through this problem by lending money to the poor people and to the average American. But that was a model that was flawed from the beginning.
But then, what do they do with these mortgages? Why do the commercial banks want to pull them and sell them off? As an example, let's say that these banks create mortgage agreements at 7%, which they then pull into a large asset-backed security at, for example, 8%, making the 1% difference an immediate cash to invest elsewhere. These banks then supply these ABSs to investment banks, which from the investment bank side is essentially gambling, as they do not know the quality of the mortgages.
The la-la land of ledger entries. It's not investment in a business that has a good idea. It's not assisting local governments in building infrastructure. It's gambling.
What do investment banks then do with these asset-backed securities? They package them up into special purpose vehicles, also known as SPVs, which are then sold to investors at a higher interest than they get for the ABSs, let's say 9%. These investors include financial intermediaries like hedge funds, pension funds, or maybe even sole investors.
You're selling something that you know has no value.
So that we may survive.
The problem is that most of these CDOs created by investment banks are sold abroad to places like the UK, France, or Germany, and many other countries, including to the east. So when a default would occur, other countries would also be affected, causing a global recession. These CDOs are almost always split up into separate tranches. Each tranche holds a certain return and a certain risk, with the senior tranche being the lowest return but the lowest risk, and the equity tranche being the highest return with the highest risk. The mezzanine is in the middle. All of these tranches pay out the same cash flows to investors, with no priority in tranches. However, as said earlier, the rate of cash flow between tranches varies according to the return rate of each tranche. However, this is different in the case of defaults. The equity tranche will receive the first hit of defaults, the mezzanine would receive the second hit, and the senior would receive the third hit, essentially cushioning the blow for more senior tranches. This is commonly referred to as the waterfall effect. However, no one ever thought of what would happen if house prices were to decrease and interest on mortgages were to rise. The incentive for mortgage holders to pay back is significantly decreased, and so they will start to default.
If you can buy a home with almost nothing down, then you do well if the prices continue to go up. If it goes down, well then you have an incentive to walk away from it and let the bank have it.
Now let's have a deeper look at the overall picture of the banking system and CDOs. As mortgage holders start to default on these subprime mortgages, it causes a domino effect, making the commercial banks' ratings go down, and in turn, negatively affecting their investment banks, which affects the SPV, which causes defaults on their investors, causing them to lose the significant amounts of money they chose to invest during the crisis.
I did warn you.
And the rating agencies? Which role did they have to play in this? The ratings agencies, such as Moody's, had vested interests in rating these CDOs high, and so they did.
I think the process was corrupted. First of all, the government licenses Moody's and Standard & Poor's, so there's only a few companies who are authorized to rate these bonds, so it wasn't really a free market. The government was in bed with Moody's and with Standard & Poor's. But also you had this perverse relationship between Wall Street and the rating agencies where they were paying the rating agencies to rate the products that they were structuring. And so there was, this was an incestuous relationship where they knew if they put bad ratings on them, they wouldn't sell. And if they didn't sell, they wouldn't be making all this money constantly rating them.
Commercial banks no longer cared about chucking out subprime mortgages left, right and centre. They could charge higher interest, and the government put a legislation down, making them hand out these poor mortgages.
The legislation was more aggressively pushing lenders to lend to people of modest means, people whose incomes were 80% of the median income or below.
I do believe in the American dream. I believe there is such a thing as the American dream. And I believe those of us who've been given positions of responsibility must do everything we can to spotlight the dream and to make sure the dream shines in all neighborhoods, all throughout our country. Owning a home is a part of that dream.
Not only did they embed this American dream in people's heads, but the government started to guarantee these mortgages.
Through Fannie and Freddie, started to guarantee mortgages. Then the lenders were no longer worried about getting their money back because the government said, we guarantee it.
And what other vested interests could banks, and senior managers especially, have?
That's part of it, but I have also another theory. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. And that is it's one of incentives. And if you look at the way most of the senior management at these institutions are paid, it's basically a bonus, and sometimes they get some stock incentives and things along those lines. But really, even if they're getting stock incentives, as we know from the option pricing model, one way to make those options more valuable is to increase the volatility of the earnings of the organization. When you look at someone who is running a Merrill Lynch or something like this, who was able to earn for the last 3 or 4 years hundreds of millions of dollars of incentive compensation, and then is subsequently fired when the bank blows up, he does not have to give back those hundreds of millions of dollars.
But how did the investment banks insure themselves against a loss in these CDOs? How did they know they weren't going to fail? Other investment banks, mainly AIG, would offer credit default swaps to other banks like Goldman Sachs, which would insure banks like Goldman receiving the swap against any losses in a CDO. But for AIG, insuring these investments was a silly move, as they were insuring a complex financial innovation where they had no idea of the quality of mortgages given out.
Let me just ask this. It looks to me as though much of what went wrong at AIG was centered on the financial products unit, AIGFP. After you left, did AIGFP become a renegade operation?
Well, I wouldn't call it renegade. I think they got greedy. I think they wrote considerably more business than they should have. I think they should have hedged. When they lost the AAA rating after I left the company, that should have been a signal to discontinue writing credit default swaps and hedge the book.
Now we will look at what made these banks invest. It is often referred to as the formula which killed Wall Street, and is renowned throughout the financial industry as being one of the factors to failure of the financial system. This formula is the Gaussian copula, created by David X. Lee, which measures the correlation between two asset classes.
It was the formula that crashed Wall Street.
As you can see from the two red rings, there are two variables which represent asset classes in the formula. This formula was originally praised for its extreme simplicity and so was used complacently to make investments in potentially risky financial products.
There are $8 trillion of paper around the world relying on that equation.
However, warnings about its limitations were ignored. Even David X. Lee stated, "Very few people understand the essence of the model."
When I first came to the field, I was sort of optimistic about using quantitative methods on the financial markets, and I don't think they're useless, but I'm trying to think how to say it. I don't think you can use quantitative methods to explain markets either.
A lot of people now rightly believe that financial models weren't the problem. It was the way in which they were used, and how loosely they were applied. The Gaussian copula is based on correlations, but it ignores some essential fundamental elements.
I mean, there are a lot of things that cause this, but I don't think models are by any means the major part. I think it's much more a question of incentives and the way the whole system works, rather than somebody foolishly relying. I mean, there are people that foolishly relied on models. Nobody can predict with accuracy how people are going to prepay their mortgages in the future, or how many companies are going to default on their bonds. There's always some view that's driving a financial model.
To reiterate the complexity of these collateralized mortgages, I'm going to show the video all over again. Don't worry, it won't be the same length as the one I just showed you. But Muhammad Yunus was wrong. Since 2001, banks started giving out more mortgages due to government legislation, but the banks didn't care about this legislation. Handing out subprime mortgages meant higher interest. The fact that they could collateralise these mortgages while making a 1 to 3% difference of interest and creating a cash flow which would allow them to use their investments elsewhere was also a huge motivation for these large banks. In conclusion, collateralised mortgage or debt obligations weren't the problem. It was the way in which they were used, from the handing out of subprime mortgages to the reliance on a subprime formula. I'll leave you with a quote from Edgar Fiedel. "He who lives by the crystal ball soon learns to eat ground glass."
There are three ways to make a living in this business. Be first, be smarter, or cheat.
This is a little song I call the Subprime Mortgage Blues. I'm gonna tell you all a story that is a little sad about what happened to the credit market when real estate went bad. This may give you a big headache. You might need another pillow. Unless you've got millions in the bank like Angelo Mazzillo. His company is Countrywide. This may come as a shock. He says his company is fine, but he keeps on selling stock. It began when Alan Greenspan cut rates to get us out of trouble as the economy